unhappy, I am, with Russia, but we'll discuss that maybe a different day. But we're very, very unhappy with them, and we're going to be doing very severe tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days.
The frustration, it's palpable. You can just sense it in the room. However, a twist like that one really could make the difference between prolonging this conflict and finally ending it. And this move also comes after several months of earnest efforts to end it by diplomatic, peaceful means. Just think about it for a moment. Trump has spoken to Russian President Vladimir Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky multiple times since taking office, and he's pushed for a ceasefire between them multiple times, publicly, but to no avail. So now the question is whether or not this new move will be a concrete step toward peace. And for his part, Trump thinks that it is, and that's exactly what he told a reporter during that meeting.
I think this is a chance at getting peace. Or it's just going to be the same thing. I have to tell you, Europe has a lot of spirit for this war. A lot of people, you know, when I first got involved, I really didn't think they did, but they do. And I saw that a month ago, and you were there, most of you, many of you were there. The level of esprit de corps, spirit that they have is amazing. They really think it's a very, very important thing to do, or they wouldn't be doing it. Look, they're agreeing to, just, you know, they're paying for everything. We're not paying anymore. We have an ocean separating us. I said, we have a problem. We make the best stuff, but we can't keep doing this.
Interesting. And for his part, Putin has already responded, and he seems to be undeterred. So according to this exclusive report by Reuters, citing 3 unnamed sources that are allegedly close to the Kremlin, Putin isn't going to change his behavior based on economic pressure from the US. The sources said Putin believes that Russia's economy and its military are strong enough to survive pressure from the West, including the sanctions that might be placed on countries that buy Russian oil, like China and India. Putin also intends to keep fighting in Ukraine until the West engages in peace talks on his terms. Moreover, one of these unnamed sources even told Reuters that Putin doesn't think the West has seriously engaged with him about the details of a peace deal. So that brings us to a really important question here. What exactly are Putin's terms for peace? Firstly, he wants a binding pledge that NATO won't expand eastward anymore. Secondly, he wants to ensure that Ukraine will remain neutral, meaning that it won't join the NATO alliance. Thirdly, he wants to limit the development of Ukraine's armed forces. And then on top of it all, he wants to keep the territory that Russia has gained since the war began. And for all we know, Putin could make even more territorial demands in Ukraine moving forward, putting President Trump into a very precarious position as he tries to make peace between Putin and Zelensky. Here with reaction is Davis Younts, a military defense attorney with Younts Law. Davis, thank you for being here today.
Riley, it's always an honor to join you.
So I have so many questions, but let's start with your initial thoughts about that meeting with President Trump and Mark Rutte.
You know, I think what we're seeing is President Trump engaging in one of the things that he has consistently demonstrated throughout his life, whether it's in business or politics, is the art of the deal. Everything he is saying in those clips you showed is directly addressed to the world, but also directly to Vladimir Putin as he is attempting to negotiate a peace deal. That's really what this is about. So I think all of that was carefully calculated. It was very candid, but everything he was saying, even just think about the way he's talking about the resolve of European nations to come together. He is telling Putin, listen, they're not giving up. They're going to support this, and they're finally willing to start paying the bill and not forcing the United States to pay the entire bill for this conflict. So I think those messages are very, very strong, and they're directed to Putin. So I think there's a lot of strategic thought that went into the way he said what he did.
And it also took weeks and months for Trump to get to this point, right? So I don't think this was a rash decision whatsoever. But speaking of, what do you make of this new plan to arm Ukraine even further?
So I think we're seeing a shift in policy from the United States. I was extremely critical of the Biden administration and their constant flood of money and arms into Ukraine because it appeared as if it was prolonging the war. What Trump's doing here, again, strategically, makes a ton of sense. He's saying, okay, NATO, if you European countries are willing to support this, then you're going to pay us for Patriot missiles, which are defensive weapons, to go into Ukraine, and they take away a strategic advantage that Russia has. So they are significant, but they're also defensive. And then NATO and European nations are paying for them. So that is an America first agenda item. That means we're not spending our money when we have a deficit. We're not spending billions of taxpayer dollars to fund this. We're actually getting paid. It's good for our manufacturing. It's good for our military industrial complex as we look at this. But it also sends a very strong message. We are going to support defensive actions if Putin is not going to come to the table and be reasonable in this. And on the tail end of this is the threat of tariffs. And the critical point, and you touched on this, and it is the critical point, it's not so much that we have a lot of direct trade with Russia, between Russia and the United States. So it's not so much tariffs on Russia that have an impact. It's the trade with China and India, which are huge trading partners of the United States. If they continue to buy Russian oil, if they continue to trade with Russia, that's those second-order tariffs and consequences that he's talking about. That will cripple the Russian economy. So I think we're going to see initial saber rattling from Vladimir Putin. I think he's going to try to take a strong position. They may try to make a quick move to take additional territory. And again, from his perspective, I think that's all part of negotiation. And then he's going to have an opportunity to be reasonable. And listen, I've said this before. I've said this since the beginning of the conflict. Vladimir Putin is not someone you can trust. He is, former KGB operative. He is an old school communist. At the same time, we can trust that he's going to try to act in the best interests of Russia and his people, and he's not a madman. And so I do think that this is all part of an extended negotiation that was thrust onto Trump by the Biden administration. And I think what we're seeing is a careful, thoughtful use of the levers of power that the United States has to engage in this. And I hope it is a strong step towards peace.
So just on that note, look, I don't know if Putin really wants peace in his heart. I'd like to think that he does. However, the terms for a peace deal that he's laid on the table, those are very interesting, and I want to get your thoughts about those. And I'd preface this by saying some of them are very rational, like you would say, so Ukrainian neutrality, making sure NATO doesn't keep expanding, but keeping some of the territory he's gained. I don't know if Zelensky's going to agree to that, and I wonder what happens if he doesn't. So what are your thoughts about his terms for peace?
Right, and I've talked about this before very publicly. I think that some reasonable agreement from NATO about westward expansion, whether or not Ukraine joins NATO, I think those are all reasonable positions for Russia to take. Because again, we have to look at what was the original intended purpose of NATO, and that really is to be an alliance against the Soviet Union, now Russia. When it comes to territorial gains, this is a critical piece of this, and this is hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict over some of this territory. So we have complicated questions about Russian access to Black Sea ports, so warm water ports. That's really, really important to them. And so I think there is compromise that can be had, but I think this is Putin reflecting a hardline negotiating position. That's why I said there may be an initial flurry of activity from the Russian military that tries to take even more territory so that they can concede and still have a buffer that they want. And again, one of the complicated factors you have in this region is some of these regions are Russian speaking, and we don't know what would happen if there was a hypothetical scenario where there were free and fair elections. We don't know how all of those people would vote. And so there are complicated factors, but look to the Crimea, study that very carefully, and understand Russia's not going to give up access to that unless they have no other options or choices. They're not going to negotiate that away. I do think they'll be willing to make territorial concessions. I think this is Putin trying to test Trump and trying to establish the boundaries for the negotiation before they come to the negotiating table.
And I would understand that because he got away with a lot under Joe Biden, and maybe he thought he could pull the same kind of tactics with President Trump, but I think he's learning very quickly that will not be the case, Davis. But now that we've talked about Putin's response, I want to ask you about Zelensky's. So he went on social media recently following that meeting on Monday, and he said this. I want to read it for you. Quote, I spoke with SecGen NATO, Mark Rutte. Another very good conversation. Mark informed about today's meeting in Washington with President Trump and about the details of cooperation between Europe and the U.S. to continue and strengthen support for Ukraine. We appreciate the readiness to provide additional patriots, and the U.S., Germany, and Norway are already working together on this. There will also be deliveries of other weapons to protect lives of our people and repel Russian assaults. It's important to increase pressure on Russia for the sake of peace and to save lives. Thank you, Mark. That's my question, though, about his statement. Will increasing pressure on Russia actually bring us closer to peace?
I think it will. I think it can. And again, I think Russia has, I think it's the second order consequences of the tariffs that we have to look at that may come in. But again, strong resolve from the United States and clear, candid statements like we heard from President Trump are such a sea change from what we saw under the Biden administration that I think that changes things. Because again, we were without a clear leader, we were without a clear strategy, and no one really, Putin wasn't going to respect Biden's public statements because it was clear he wasn't fully in charge of what was happening, and he was kind of moving by whims. So again, this language from Zelensky is interesting. Again, Zelensky has made part of this problem worse because he has listened to people from the Biden administration. He's listened to a lot of the wrong people. He's listened to progressive media outlets in the United States that gave him terrible advice about how to approach this and how to approach President Trump. I think he's learned a lot. I think he's humbled himself a little bit. I think he understands he's going to have to express gratitude for what the United States has done. Even if President Trump doesn't agree with what happened, he can at least express gratitude for it. So I think if he continues in that direction, then I think he will be in a much better position. Again, though, this conflict is one that never should have started in the first place, continues to be prolonged. Zelensky has made critical errors in this process. I hope he is sincere in coming forward. But ultimately, he is in an extremely difficult position because he doesn't have a lot of bargaining chips, and he can't continue this war without support from Europe.
Completely. And he never could have fought it without European or American support. And look, all I want is peace, no more bloodshed, no more destruction or violence. And we had a peace deal on the table less than 2 months after this whole war started, and Tony Blinken came in, former Secretary of State, and said, nope, we're not going to move forward with that. And that was a really disgusting decision on his part, and I think that was one of these critical errors that Zelensky has made and hopefully learned from. So we'll have to see what happens in 50 days, Davis, but thank you for being here today.
Thank you. Take care.
It's left to men like Davis Younts fighting for these Navy SEALs. Davis Younts, you are an attorney who has successfully defended naval officers.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending.
Davis Younts successfully defended an evangelical Navy lieutenant